Good evening and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. And man, what a fall we have had. Hasn't this been great for getting all our fall work done? Um, Tonight would be a very nice evening to be getting some of that work done. But I really appreciate your joining me as we talk about some of the things around our yards and gardens and flower beds and landscapes that we can do to make next year's even better. And I really appreciate it in our own yard and garden that we've had such a nice extended autumn here in order to get this much done. So this evening, for the next half an hour, 40 minutes, we'll take a look at some of the things we can do to make next year even better. And I'm Don Kinsler. I'm the NDSU Extension Horticulture Agent here in Cass County. And I'm coming to you from my office this evening. And now it's interesting as we think about the fall. Of course, it's a wonderful time to enjoy, and I enjoy getting out into a yard and doing just puttering around, getting things done, preparation. And it's interesting when we think about it. Each year is a cycle, isn't it? The springs come and go, the summers come and go, fall, winter, then another spring. But really, gardening isn't just a cycle like that. It's kind of an onward and upward, uh, kind of a spiral. Hopefully, if we're kind of learning and doing things a little better each year, instead of just kind of going around in circles each year, we're kind of progressing onward and upward in kind of an upward spiral. And of course, now this year, I don't know about you all, but this year's been kind of a challenging growing season. It started out so wet and rainy for so long, and there were so many leaf diseases on everything from lilacs to crabapple trees, willows, poplars had a lot. And I noticed even our iris in areas that weren't very well drained, our iris didn't do well, had some foliage type diseases. And so it's interesting. Each year that we can gain a little bit of information and education, next year can always be a little bit better. Okay, for example, in our own yard, in flower beds, our iris came down with some rotting and some foliage type diseases. So next year, I'm going to have more fungicide on hand because they, of course, need to be applied as preventatives before the disease or the rot really gets established. So I'm going to have more fungicides on hand. So, no matter how many years we've been doing gardening, we can always learn a little something new and we can always improve our technique. So let's start this evening with lawn care. Some of the things that we can do this fall here, late this fall, to make next year's lawn even better. And of course, the seeding cutoff was about September 15th. That is considered the date at which, if you want to seed some bare areas or overseed a thin lawn, that is considered the date at which you should have your seeding done if you want it to sprout and become established enough to survive winter. Now, it's been a long fall. If right now, if you've got a bare area, if you wanted to try it, keep it continually moist. I don't know if it would establish enough to make it through winter. I wouldn't bank on it. But you could try it if you wanted. One of the keys to getting grass seed to sprout and to sprout well and quickly and get a good stand is keeping that soil constantly what I call dark moist. Don't let the surface get kind of light colored and dry, but keep that surface dark moist because grass seed is seeded so thinly, so shallowly. And you've done it right if you can see most of the grass seed still on the surface when you're done. It barely gets raked in. And because it's seeded so shallowly, it's very prone to drying out. And of course, if it starts to germinate a little and then dries out, it can quickly die. So it's so very important. So if you did want to risk seeding right now, keep it uniformly moist. But again, no guarantee that it would establish enough to survive winter. There is an alternative way, though, that grass can be seeded in the fall, and that is called dormant seeding. Okay, we pause for about a month now because seeding right now, you don't know if it's going to establish enough. But we can pause and do a dormant seeding, and that is done right before you think the snow is going to fly, or seeded when the ground temperature gets cold. See, grass seed needs temperatures of about 50 to 55 degrees in order to sprout. So if we delay until the soil temperature has cooled below that threshold, it will just stay there. So get your soil kind of ready, and then sometime maybe mid-November or so, then do the seeding. Um, Water it in a little bit. If your hoses are still thawed out, water it in a little bit just so it kind of freezes in place so it doesn't all blow away. Or do it if there's a snow forecast that's going to stay. And that grass seed will stay in place. You can even overseed an existing lawn in this way to thicken it up. And that grass seed will stay in place over winter and be all ready to go next spring when the soil warms up enough. And my wife Mary and I did this a number of years ago on the first lawn we ever seeded at our home, and it worked quite nicely. And so it can start germinating next spring before conditions are such that you could get in and seed. Because in the spring of the year, sometimes the soil might be a little too moist for you to rake and get it prepared. So there can be some advantages to dormant seeding. So anyway, let's talk next about fertilizing. Now, fertilizing was best accomplished for fall around Labor Day, because around Labor Day, and then if it gets moisture or you water it in, that fertilizer is going to give the nutrition to the grass in order to fill in good, get a good deep root system, and it gives it that nutrition that is needed for a good, healthy fall growth. Okay, now I did fertilize about Labor Day. The only problem is we haven't had any rain. And I save our water for the vegetables and the flowers and the trees and shrubs. And so I think most of that fertilizer is kind of just sitting there, down about at kind of root level, soil level. But it'll be okay. Now, good question is, we haven't had our fall rains and a lot of lawns are dormant. Our lawn is crunchy brown. It's drought dormant because we haven't had generous rains where we live in South Fargo. Oh, gosh, I don't know, July sometime. It's been really, really dry in South Fargo. So dry that the ground is cracking. I don't want to drop any tools out in the yard or garden because they might disappear down one of the cracks. So anyway, it would have been very nice if in September or early October we got some nice gentle rains to replenish our lawns, the moisture. So at this point, there's not much rain in the forecast. And so it looks like our lawns are likely to go into winter in kind of a dry state. Now, this has all happened before. I know 2 or 3 years ago, and it has been, what, about 3 or 4 dry years. A couple of years ago, I was kind of concerned because our lawn did go into winter in a drought dormant situation, and the next spring it did come out fine. But I'm always a little nervous because it would be nice to have had the grass kind of replenish itself, get green and actively growing before winter set in. So one of the questions is, should we water our lawns now? And watering the lawn would probably be a good idea, giving it one good soaking of an inch. That probably isn't going to all of a sudden make it green up because, of course, winter is coming. The days are getting short. But it would at least give some moisture into the crowns and into the root system a little bit because frost always penetrates deeper into dry ground. And so to help some of our soils fill up the cracks a little bit and just get a little moisture in there, it would probably be a good idea to give lawns a water. watering if they haven't received enough moisture. And of course, I also like the tuna can set out under the sprinkler because a tuna can is about 1 inch deep, and that will let a person know when you've applied about 1 inch. And so, some of us, if we don't water lawns, they're probably going to be okay. But if you have a lawn that you are able to water, then maybe 1 inch would be a good idea. Now, fertilizing in mid-October is a little bit controversial. Mid-October to late October, a little controversial. If you do fertilize in October, the lawn isn't automatically going to die, but there is some research that indicates that fertilizing too late in the season could cause a little spurt of activity that might not have time to toughen up in time, and potentially there could be a little bit of dieback in the lawn. But again, so much depends on what happens during the winter time, how much snow we get, and again, not fertilizing in October is a little bit controversial. The recommendations aren't hard and fast on that yet, because some recommendations do indicate to give another late fertilizing. But with the way the moisture has been, I think I'd probably skip any more fertilizing for the year on our lawns. But one thing we can be doing is to control the hard to kill weeds in our lawns. Now, of course, the creeping Charlie on the left-hand side, that's in full force yet. And of course, thistles. They like it when it's hot and dry. And even though our lawn is cracked, we've still got some thistles that are doing quite nicely. And the fall, right now in October, is a great time to control hard to kill weeds. So whether it's a lawn weed herbicide, that will kill just the broadleaf weeds and doesn't harm the lawn, whether you do that or whether you're spot treating thistles, I'm going to spot treat thistles. You can use the different lawn weed killers like that have 2,4-D or glyphosate if you target only the weeds. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in original Roundup and certain other brands of it too. And it's interesting as we're looking at the thistle there. An old gardener once mentioned to me, he said, you don't need to douse that whole thistle with chemical such as glyphosate. He said, because sometimes that thistle maybe it's in a flower bed and you don't want to risk overspraying, or maybe it's in a lawn and, if you used glyphosate Roundup, it's going to kill the surrounding grass. But that old gardener said, if you just take a little something, maybe it's a little squirt bottle, or maybe it's just a little sponge dipped in the product. And of course, always wear protective gloves. But just a little dab of that product put down in the center of those leaves, kind of down in that growing point. If you just get a little bit of that chemical down in there, that growing point is where that weed takes the product down in. And I've tried that and it really does work. So we don't always need to douse the whole weed, especially in where you're just trying to target weeds that are close to something else. Now, the reason that fall is a good time to control hard to kill weeds is because many of these perennial weeds that live from year to year, many of these in the fall of the year are carrying materials down into their root system so that they have the energy to come back and haunt us next year. And so if we apply herbicides to these, they will also carry that herbicide down into the root system more effectively than they do almost at any other time. So until we have really hard killing frosts, we can certainly be doing weed control. And even after we've had a little bit of frost, if those weeds are still turgid, we can even apply chemical at that point. So I've got to get out and do a little weed control myself. Now on the mowing, of course, the season-long recommended mowing height is about 3 inches high. But in October or so, during the last 1 or 2 mowings, we can reduce that down to 2 inches, no lower than 1.5 inches. 2 inches would really be about right. And if you leave the lawn too high and it gets too floppy, there can be a little more snow mold under the snow during winter time or next spring. And also, A lawn that's left too high is great habitat for voles. Those are the little field mice that love to make their tunnels under the snow, and then you discover their damage next spring after the snow disappears, and you see these meandering kind of channels all over your lawn. So less habitat helps reduce that too. Now, there's one thing in that pretty picture that maybe I wouldn't do. I'd take off the bagger attachment because really, when a person bags up lawn clippings, you're hauling away, well, unless you put it on your compost area, but you're hauling away a valuable a resource because the lawn clippings, if allowed to filter down in, they decompose into a nice compost right there on the lawn. And as they break down, they contribute nutrients and fertilizer back into the soil, and they help decrease weed pressure, keep the soil more moist. So there's a lot to be said about just letting those clippings filter back down in. I was so happy when they invented the mulching lawnmower blade. Now, Minnesota has a really nice lawn care calendar, and of course, it works for us here in North Dakota too. But a couple of things I wanted to point out here, and of course, they recommend watering, through late October. And let's see, the other thing I was going to mention was aerating and dethatching. Aerating and dethatching, you can do that in the fall here. September, I wouldn't be afraid to do it now also. And so you can do that now or next spring works well too. Now, in the spring of the year, a person should really wait until about the middle of May for most of these things because otherwise the grass is kind of a little bit tender. And mention here too on their chart, the weed control, they mentioned September through late October is the best time also to do it. And of course, any of these operations are always nice if you've got someone sitting there watching to make sure you're doing it right. I couldn't resist adding that in. Now, I love this. Mulching leaves into the lawn. Instead of raking the leaves away and bagging them up and hauling to a compost collection site, we can just simply mulch them down into the lawn with a few passes of the lawn mower. And this research was done at Ohio State University a number of years ago. And they did a study to see if you just mulch these leaves back in, do they have any benefit? And of course, so the researchers did what researchers do. They replicated the study. They had one plot of grass in which they put leaves mulched on in. The plot beside it had no leaves put on. And so they replicated it, etc. And they checked then to see what happens over about a 3 or 4 year period. And so here's what they found. When you mulched the leaves down into the lawn, that lawn became healthier. The root system became deeper. There were less weeds in the area in which they mulched leaves in, less weeds. The soil was more moist farther down, which is always good for grass. And also, oh, and of course, the organic matter in the soil was higher because the had disintegrated. And also, the other thing I was trying to remember, the nutrient quantity in the soil was much higher. So what these leaves do when you mulch them up, break them down in, it's almost like top dressing the lawn with some nice composty type material. And it helps the little microbe the microorganisms to do their thing. And but now one thing that they did emphasize, there's an upper limit to the amount of leaves that you can mulch down in. After you've made a couple of passes over the leaves, they have to have filtered down in. They can't lay on the surface blocking the sunlight because that would diminish the health of the lawn. And so if on a lawn, if the leaves kind of blow all into one area, well, then maybe just rake them out and spread them out a little bit so that you've got a uniform coverage so that they'll all mow down in. I must admit, though, I kind of do miss the aroma of burning leaves in the fall, but we were burning up kind of a valuable resource. So mulching those down in it's also kind of fun, I've found. All right. Let's move from the lawn to the vegetable garden. I should mention too that if you have any questions as we go along, type them into the chat box or the Q&A, and um, we've got a few questions coming in already. So thanks. So please continue to type those into the chat box or the Q&A, and when we're all done, we'll address those questions. Thanks. All right, now in the vegetable garden, let's look at some ways so that our next year's vegetable garden will be even better than this year's has been. Well, if you haven't yet, excuse me, it's soon time to harvest pumpkins, squash. Now, pumpkins and squash can certainly be left out in the garden until the frost collapses the vines. And, a frost of 30 to 32 degrees certainly is not going to hurt them at all. I can always find our squash better if the frost has kind of collapsed the vines. And carrots do become sweeter if left in the ground as long as possible, because the cool temperatures do convert the starches to sugar. So carrots do become sweeter. Now, onions, when it's nice and dry like it's been, perfect time to get those up and out of the garden. Potatoes also. I haven't dug all our potatoes yet. We've been kind of digging them for meals. But man alive, has our soil become very hard. Of course, our garden is on the south edge of Fargo in the Red River Valley clay soil, and the soil has become very, very, very hard. And one thing, rhubarb. The time to dig and divide rhubarb is in September or early next spring, just as it's poking out of the ground. But rhubarb can be divided in September. I have had some emails from people mentioning they were either moving and want to take rhubarb along, or somebody offered them some rhubarb and could they still do it? I wouldn't be afraid to dig and divide rhubarb now, even though it's kind of a little on the late side. If you have your preference or your that if you have it as an option, I'd maybe wait until next spring at this point. But if you have to, I think it would still probably work at this point. The soil's been so nice and warm. And asparagus tops, the nice big ferny parts of asparagus, should be left intact over winter, because if we don't have much snow, it does help to catch what little snow we do have, and asparagus winters better. If we had a very severe test winter with very little snow and very cold temperatures, especially on dry soil, even asparagus has been known to freeze out. Leaving the tops intact until early next spring and then cutting them back does help asparagus to winter better. Now, at the certain point when it's time to clean up the vegetable garden, there are certain vegetables that should have the above ground parts removed off of the garden. Tomato, pepper, the vine crops of cucumber, pumpkin, squash, melons. All of those are best removed off of the garden. The reason for those is they tend to carry leaf type diseases and molds and mildews and things which can overwinter on the vines. And so rather than incorporating those down into the soil and having a habitat for disease organisms, it's probably best to take those off. But many other things, vegetable crops, can just be chopped up and returned right into the soil. Things like cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, carrot tops, radishes, probably string beans. All of those can be just kind of chopped up and worked back into the soil for some good organic material. And of course, in the vegetable garden too, it's a great time to control weeds. It seems there's a few thistle that always want to pop up in our vegetable garden, so good time to do some spot spraying. And I'm a big proponent of spot spraying, whether it be the lawn that we mentioned earlier or the vegetable garden. Most situations are not a carpet of weeds, and so there's no need to carpet the soil or lawn with weed spray, because most herbicides are contact killers. They're not preventers for most types of herbicides. So that means we just need to contact the weeds that are actually there. And so spot spraying. works very, very well as a good use of resources and a good way to kill our weeds. In the fall of the year, great time to add compost, leaves, or other organic material into the vegetable garden. You can rototill or spade it in. And even leaves, tree leaves, if you've got excess that you couldn't mulch all into your lawn, leaves worked into the garden soil. By next spring, they've all already kind of rotted down and turned into nice compost. So many of these materials worked in a little bit into the top soil. Many of these materials by next spring already will have broken down. Now, let's turn to trees and shrubs. Now, for planting trees and shrubs, and the same is kind of true of perennial flowers too, early October is considered kind of the planting cutoff. And the reason for that is newly planted trees and shrubs and perennials do a lot of rooting in the fall of the year. They aren't just kind of sitting there. They spend their fall developing nice roots, and that gives them a head start for next spring. So there are advantages to fall planting, gives you a head start. But they need about 1 month of unfrozen soil in order to develop their roots. Now, for most of our northern area here, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, parts of South Dakota, somewhere the first half of November is when the soil starts to freeze. And of course, this depends on how far north and south you are within our states. But generally, the soil starts to freeze down to where you can't get a shovel in it anymore, sometime during the first half of November. Sometimes it's early November, sometimes it's the middle of November. But in that 2 week time period, the soil usually freezes. And so we need to have our shrubs, perennials, trees planted a month before that. So that's why early October is considered that cutoff, because it'll have the whole month in which they can root in. So today is the 8th. I'm still planting a few things. And so the soil's still been warm, but at some point it's going to shut down. A couple of important things for things that you do plant, and if you're kind of pushing it a little bit here and still doing some planting, make sure you water them in very well after planting. And also another thing that helps buy you a little bit of time of unfrozen soil is to put a mulch around the tree, shrub, or perennial. I like shredded wood type products because that meshes together very well. And a 3 to 5 inch layer is considered a good one. So by mulching the fall type planted material, you can kind of keep that soil from freezing and give it a little extra rooting time, and that increases the success rate. Now, watering things, not just the newly planted, but watering our other established things, such as evergreens. Very important to water evergreens. And because the soil is so dry across much of the region, and if it's dry where you're at, um, very important this fall to be watering. And when I say water, really apply about an inch or maybe even more. Let the hose slowly run around evergreens, and not just at the very base of the trunk, but also kind of out beyond the branches a ways, because the root system extends out beyond the branches. So give a good deep soaking to things. And in fact, I noticed this afternoon, I took a few hours off before our program, and I noticed in our perennial garden, even though it's mulched with wood chips, um, I can see soil cracking. It's gotten dry even under the mulching. So I'm going to go through the kind of entire area and get some moisture on that to kind of get that surface to moisten, rehydrate, get the cracks to kind of fill in, get the soil to expand. And so I'm going to water not just newly planted things, not just evergreens. I'm going to do a fair amount of watering. Now, old established shade trees, I mean, they're good to go. Their roots are down and finding moisture. Because now when I dig and have planted some material here recently, there is subsoil moisture because we were so wet so early. So there's good subsoil moisture, but man, is the top foot or so getting really, really dry. And here is mulching that I mentioned. Now, if we take a look at the picture to the left there, um, there's a rule of thumb when mulching, and that's the 5-5-5 rule. Now, that is around a tree, a 5 foot diameter circle, 5 foot across, and the mulch should be about 5 inches thick or deep, because that's going to settle down to about 3 inches. And it should be kept about 5 inches away from the trunk. It should not be mounted directly up to the trunk. I can't tell for sure, but I think that mulch on this tree might be a little too close to the trunk. It almost looks like it's touching the trunk. So pull that back away from the trunk, otherwise the trunk could actually rot. And so the preferred shape of mulch around a tree is more like a donut instead of a volcano. We used to say the 3-3-3 rule, but human nature being what it is, 3-3-3 rule, maybe if you fudge a little on that, it gets down too much. So 5-5-5 rule gives us humans a little leeway. See if we, do 5 foot diameter. Well, maybe if we actually measured it, maybe we only did 4, but that's still good. And again, 5 inches thick, that's going to settle down to about 3. So I like the 5-5-5 rule on that. And around trees, young trees, fruit trees, make sure that we add trunk guards to both prevent against winter sun scald injury, but also to guard against rabbits. After all the greenery is gone in our gardens and yards, they start looking for shrubs, roses, fruit trees, and so putting a fence around for rabbits. Now, the wrap that I like most, okay, the previous photo showed the white tree guards that you kind of put around the tree trunk. I like the tree wrap that's on a roll, as shown here. And you can buy this at garden centers. You tape the bottom and then start spiraling on up, kind of overlapping it. That protects against sun scald and protects against rabbits. You can use it on larger sized trees. And fruit trees especially can get sun scald at a fairly large trunk size. So this gives you a larger trunk that you can wrap. Also, if there are lower branches, such as on an apple tree, you can spiral this up kind of in between the branches and get a little higher up on the main trunk. So I really like that product for use. Now, pruning. There really isn't a good reason to prune in fall. It's much better to wait until springtime. And here's the reason for that. Our trees and shrubs are slowing down. We haven't even had frost yet in the Fargo area. And if you notice, the trees are already turning yellow. So in response to the day length, trees and shrubs are signaled to start slowing down their growth in preparation for winter time. And so growth just starts gradually slowing down. And if we make pruning cuts in the fall, those pruning cuts do not seal over the way they do right before springtime because cell growth is slowing down. So the cells that do that sealing of the pruning wounds aren't as active. And so pruning wounds are more apt to be left open all winter long and more subject to desiccation and drying out with the possibility of some winter dieback. And there's really no advantage to pruning in fall. Now, definitely, if a shrub is hanging out over the sidewalk and would get caught in the snowblower, then definitely go ahead and prune it. And if you have pruned or trimmed things, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to die. And so don't be alarmed if you have trimmed some things. But it just opens the way. There's a little increased possibility of something going wrong. And since there's really no good reason to prune in the fall. It's better to wait until early spring, just before the growth is going to start on our things. And that's a common question is this a good time to prune? And really, it would be better to wait. Okay, now I mentioned watering, getting some water around, especially young trees. And so, how much to water? When we water with a garden hose, sometimes it's hard to hold that hose in place long enough because we get impatient. So we put a little water on, then move to the next thing. Sometimes we don't water things thoroughly enough. For example, a young tree, or even one planted within the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, that we want to make sure it's hydrated. We want to get water on it. Um, a good soaking once a week or once every 10 days is all that's needed. We don't need to be watering every day. But anyway, I like to use the 5-gallon bucket. Okay, so I drag my hose out there to the trees, and instead of just holding the hose down there by the tree, because I don't know how much water I'm actually putting, first I fill up the 5-gallon bucket and then pour it on the tree. Okay, for example, most young trees would benefit from about 10, maybe even 15 gallons of water. That's a long time to hold the hose, and I get impatient. So by filling up that bucket and then slowly pouring it around, all around the root system, not just up next to the trunk, but all around, that forces me to give the tree the hydration that it needs, plus extend it out a ways. So I would definitely water kind of out at the perimeter of that mulch that you see as well. Oh, and roses. Gosh, the roses are blooming so nice. The hardy Canadian roses are blooming. They've got a nice flush of bloom now. And so, again, any that you do not need to prune, delay until springtime. Because, again, those open cuts are kind of an area where the rose canes could dry out and a little more winter injury. So delay pruning until next April works well. And if they are tender type roses, covering them after we've had cold temperatures. Right now, it's too early to cover them. They'd probably mold underneath. But wait until we get some good cold temperatures and then protect the tender type roses. Now, my wife Mary and I like the Canadian hardy, winter hardy roses, and those we don't cover at all. Maybe they get a little tip dye back. They like pruning anyway. So in the spring, we give them a good prune, and we've never needed, even in fairly open winters, we've never needed to cover those. But if you do need to cover roses, sometime around the 1st of November is better than doing it in October. Also, part of the no pruning on roses in fall is that the hips, those orange, reddish orange fruit that they form after the flowers fade, research has shown that they survive winter if those hips are left on. So at a certain point in the fall, we can stop deadheading our flowers, let them form into hips, and that helps them to winter even better. And roses love, I should say, rabbits love roses. And so fencing is good. Sometimes they do the pruning for us, but if they nibble them all the way down to soil level, sometimes they don't leave much for us. So fencing for rabbits works well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about fruit trees. Of course, wrap the trunks, even on fairly old fruit trees, until they develop a very corky, ridged bark. If they still have a smooth bark, even an older apple tree will benefit from wrapping. And rake up any fallen fruit. The fallen fruit oftentimes will have some insects in them. Raking off those fallen fruits is just good sanitation. That can help prevent an infestation of next year's insects. So getting rid of them is good. And of course, fencing from pests. Um, apple trees, plum trees are all in the rose family, and so they're all attacked by rabbits and deer. Uh, they must have something in their bark and twigs that is just favorable and or flavorful. So they're targets in the wintertime for those. Now let's go to the annual flower beds. Of course, the tender flower bulbs, those things that need to be dug up and taken indoors for storage because they can't survive winter most years anyway, out in the ground. Those are things like gladiolus, dahlias, cannas. They need to be dug up about the time of the first frost. They can have frost on them because that's not going to affect the below ground portion. So about the time, either a little before, a little after, dig those up, cut the tops off, and then you store them. We could do a whole program on how to store gladiolus and dahlias and cannas. If you have any favorite flower seeds, you can save seeds of some of them. Now, if they're hybrid flower seeds, they probably would not return with the same quality of what you planted. But some things like cleome, some marigolds, zinnias are quite easy to collect the seed from. Then annual flower beds should be cleaned up, especially if any of the flowers had disease. Some flowers you can just kind of chew up. Sometimes are the flower beds at our own home there, which you see in the left photo there. Sometimes I'll just take the old lawnmower blade and run over the whole works, grind it on up, and then rototill that in. It makes good organic matter. But if any of it is diseased, um, mildews, blights, aster yellow disease, then pull and dispose off-site. Also a good time on any raised flower gardens to incorporate some compost or organic matter. Now let's talk about perennial gardens, some things that we can do to make next year's flower gardens even better. Now, September was the time to dig and divide peonies, daylilies, bleeding hearts, iris. If they weren't doing so good, and when I say weren't doing so good, if they weren't blooming, if the center of that perennial was dead in the center and all the good stuff was around the outside, that happens a lot with iris. Iris, oftentimes the old part of the iris patch is just devoid of any leaves and all the good stuff is on the perimeter. And so that's a sign that that should be dug and divided. So that should all have been really done in September. If you didn't get it done, and if you didn't care for didn't care whether you have a little increased risk, you could still do it. I divided some iris this afternoon. But again, if something goes wrong, well, I won't cry about it. I realize the risk. But September would have been the better time for those things. Iris even into August. So can you still do it? Yeah, as long as you kind of don't mind a little increased risk because the window has kind of closed on those. And of course, fall planting. I've got some tulip bulbs to plant yet. Fall is the time to plant bulbs of tulips and daffodils, hyacinths, and those can be planted yet into October. Some of the things, though, like daffodils and hyacinths, really earlier in September would have given a little better growth that you would see next spring. Now, the perennial plants, good time to add organic material around perennial plants and work it in the fall here. Of course, there the photo shows kind of a little beyond fall. They've gotten snowfall. But especially this year, I've noticed our ground is so hard. It went from way too wet to way too dry. And in the meantime, our soil anyway has become very hard even under some of the mulch. So now would be a good time to kind of around perennials to maybe incorporate some compost or peat moss down in, and that organic matter helps heavy soil to be more open and mellow. And also, if you have sandy soil, it helps give a little more moisture holding capacity to it. Now, most perennials are best if you leave the above ground portions, the tops, intact over winter because they are spots where little pollinators will create nests in the fall of the year for overwintering, and then they pollinate our apples and cucumbers next year. So leaving those intact, plus they look nice over winter. Also, if we have a really open winter with only a little snow, perennials tend to survive winter better with those tops, the above ground portions left intact, and then remove them early next spring, sometime early April, before the new growth starts emerging from from the base. But now there are a couple of perennials that just turn to mush. They don't have the structure to stay nice and upright during wintertime. They just plop apart, and or they get disease in the case of peonies. So for sanitation with peonies, it's best to cut them down only about an inch above ground level and dispose of those above ground portions off site. And so peonies are so susceptible to mildew that cutting them off in the fall, and now is a good time, and disposing those tops is important. And daylilies, iris, and hosta just plop apart. And by next spring, they're just kind of a mushy mess. So about the time of the first fall frost, they can all be cut back. Now, some of our daylilies I notice are already kind of going dormant. So I've started cleaning up the daylilies already, getting the old dead stuff out of them, cutting them back. Iris also, our iris are starting to look not so hot anymore. So I'm starting to do the hosta. The iris or the hosta have not collapsed from frost yet, but about the time that a frost is forecast, it's a lot easier to cut them back when they're still kind of turgid rather than when they've all plopped apart and become mushy. So those are a few of the perennials that one could or should cut back. Now, any newly planted perennials, such as this summer or this fall, really would benefit from a mulch, at least by early November. That'll help them winter a little better, give a little protection around the soil. Now, if the rest of you who are tuned in, or if your soil is as dry as ours is, like I mentioned before, giving the perennial garden just a little bit of soaking would be great. And there you see a sprinkler with a tuna can, maybe another straight-sided can. They've even got a rain gauge. So I guess they're hitting all the bases there to see how much moisture they're putting on. But again, since there's subsoil moisture, uh, a half an inch to an inch would get our topsoil kind of hydrated again. And many perennials, such as the hosta, aren't overly deep rooted. Most of their roots are in the top foot of soil. So if we can rehydrate the surface this fall, that'll get some moisture into those root systems. So I do think that most of our area, we should start giving them some moisture. And because our soil is so heavy in our own flower garden, um, I'm giving it several light sprinklings close together. I'm wetting it down, letting that soak in, then I'm going to return and soak it down in rather than giving a deluge all at once. So you have to kind of use a little bit of judgment as to how to re-moisten that top foot or so of soil. Now, outdoor containers, gosh, they've done nice this fall. A lot of ours are still blooming heavily outside. And so, but when it is time to call it quits for outdoor containers, we should remove the old plants. We can say reuse the soil, we can save that, but the old plants should be taken out. Otherwise, next spring, it's kind of depressing to take the containers out and the old plants are all there kind of mushy. So anyway, we can remove those. That also is good sanitation to help prevent diseases. Can we reuse potting mix? We sure can. If you start with a high quality potting mix, now many of us, I'm sure you guys do the same thing, um, each spring take out a little bit of that old potting mix and mix in maybe a fourth new and kind of mix it, blend it on in. And because you're reusing potting mix, a lot of the initial fertilizer is probably gone. So we do need to fertilize more often and regularly on those. And any containers that are crackable, at least a portion of the potting mix should be taken out in case that container would crack. All right. And of course, there are many things, container plants that can be brought indoors during winter. Um, a week ago, we talked during a webinar all about how to winter geraniums. But besides geraniums, mandevilla, that's a fairly easy one to overwinter. Thunbergia vine, hibiscus can be done. Now, just real quick, a few pictures here on our own geranium wintering method. Okay, so out of the geranium pots, we lift the geranium plants, shake off the roots, cut them way back to only a couple inches above the soil level. And usually they don't even have any roots left. Then we pot them up in a little square pot, similar to what you would buy a geranium in, about 4.5 inches square or round. And then we grow them in our basement under LED or fluorescent lights. They don't have to be plant lights. Regular LED and fluorescent work just fine. Or you can grow them in a sunny window too. And of course, there's all sorts of other ways to winter them, but that's a way that you keep them actively growing, and it really does work well. Well, excuse me. Plants like mandevilla, quite easy to just wash them off well, protect them for insects, and bring them in, put them in a sunny window, and maybe repot too. And then house plants that were outdoors for the summertime, good time to repot outdoors. It's so much easier to do that kind of messy work outside rather than on the kitchen table. So any house plants, take them outside to repot, or if you're bringing them in, give them a good repotting, wash them off well. Good time to give them a good washing with the gentle hose. And gosh, and it's fun to replenish your supply of house plants by going buy some new ones at the garden center. Boy, and that is a lot easier when the weather is like this than in January when we have to cover them so carefully. And treating with a systemic houseplant insecticide is photographed there. You can buy that at garden centers, and the directions tell how many teaspoons or tablespoons to put on a certain size pot. Now that is taken up by the root system and protects the plants from within, especially beneficial for protection against spider plants and aphids and mealybugs. And for fungus gnats, those annoying little black insects that flies that flit around houseplants, mosquito beds. So check the garden centers and hardware stores before they get rid of this for the season. If you look carefully at the label, it says mosquito bits kills mosquitoes, also controls fungus gnats. And so these granules are put onto the soil surface, watered in well, and they kill the larvae that are in the soil. Now, it takes a while for that to break the life cycle. So a person does need patience with that in order for it to work, but it does work. Now, if you haven't tried listening to our podcast yet, Forum Communications' John Lamb and I do a weekly gardening podcast called Growing Together, a gardening podcast. We do that each week, and we enjoy kind of just talking about all things gardening. And so if you just do an online search for Growing Together, a gardening podcast, you'll find that. Gosh, what a wonderful time of year. I'm already looking forward to next spring. And of course, all these things that we've talked about are really ways to kind of not only put our yards and gardens to bed, but also to give them kind of the energy and what they need to come back in full force next spring again. So I'm already looking forward to next spring. Yeah, it'd be kind of nice to have the quiet time of the rest of fall and winter. But boy, I can hardly wait again for next spring. Okay, now let's take a look at the chat box. And by the way, thank you. There are nearly 100 of you that joined this evening, so I really appreciate these. I enjoy doing these webinars. So let's take a look at some questions. Is it required to rake the leaves before the final mowing with a mulching mower? Oh, I see. Sure. You mentioned then that we discussed that. Sure. So you can, in that final mowing, when you've got leaves on the lawn, you can combine mulching the leaves in with that final mowing or two. Okay, next question. When talking about broadleaf herbicide, can you apply that rule to weeds in the vegetable garden as well? Yep, definitely. Fall is a great time in the vegetable garden to handle weeds. I need to do the same. And again, spot treating, I think is a wonderful way to go. Next question is, My rhubarb, which is very healthy, looks as if it's a first or second year plant and very spindly. I have no idea why. Well, that was very, very common this year. Many things didn't thrive well. Rhubarb was one of them. Now, for many things, trees, shrubs, perennials, we had too long of an extended wet, rainy period early, and it was just a petri dish of fungus and bacteria activity. And once plants get infected like that, and then if conditions are just right or wrong, however you term it, those fungi and bacteria can just thrive, and thrive they did. And so um, our rhubarb did about the same thing that our iris did. They had noticeable leaf spots on. And so some things, our iris, very noticeable, actually, I think went downhill from that heavy, rainy, wet period. And so if your rhubarb looks like it was kind of went downhill and regressed, so now it looks like it was a first or second year plant, um, just kind of hang tight. Next spring, give it some really good fertilizer, a water soluble type or types like ammonium sulfate, kind of an acid-based fertilizer. But also, after we get a frost, clear cut, I shouldn't say clear cut, clear pull, because rhubarb, we don't really cut it, we pull. So after it's all, limped down by frost, then remove the leaves and stalks. After a good couple of freezes, they'll just pull off. And so get rid of that, the leaves and old stalks, because that can be a source of infection for next year. Do herbicides require sunlight to work, such as spray in the morning and not in the evening? That's an interesting question. Herbicides don't require sunlight as such, but they do require warm, the right warmth. Temperature. For example, if we could do our fall spraying when the temperatures are maybe in the 70s, 70 to 75, herbicides don't or like it if you put them on when it's too hot. Mid 80s or 90s can cause more burning or damage to the peripheral type plants if you get them on that. And also, even some weeds tend to shut down a little if temperatures get too high. So the preferred is when the weed would be comfortable at 70 to 75 degrees. So maybe the middle of the day or late afternoon would work. So again, more temperature dependent than actual sunlight. Do blackberries fit into the category? Blackberries tend to be a little bit borderline hardiness in our area, but uh, let's see. So I'm not wondering if you're maybe wondering about pruning the blackberries or Um, let's talk just a little bit about raspberries, blackberries. Uh, Raspberry pruning can be done in the fall of the year. Raspberries fruit on canes, and then that cane dies, and then the canes that grew this current year, they're the ones that fruit next year. It's kind of a complicated thing, but anyway, and the fall is kind of an exception pruning on raspberries. The canes that fruited this year on the summer bearing raspberries, those will die over winter. And so while you can identify those, they can be pruned out. We should do a whole thing on how to prune raspberries, then also talk about blackberries. When and how to prune hydrangeas. Do we cut off the heads in the fall? Now, again, a heavy pruning on hydrangeas is best delayed until next spring, and so that we don't open up wounds. But those heads on hydrangeas can become quite heavy, and if we get a wet, heavy snow, hydrangea branches can be broken down, and we don't want the branches to really break. Hydrangea blossoms look kind of decorative over winter, so it's kind of your own judgment call. But if you're concerned about the flower heads catching snow and breaking branches, then yeah, by all means. And it's fairly easy on hydrangeas. Sometimes the flowers will just almost snap off at the little a kind of attachment where they attach to the branch. Sometimes just by hand, you can almost just pull them off, or with the little pruning snips, just snip them off. So we aren't really pruning back into branches as such. We're just kind of cutting off the little attachment where the flowers were attached. All right. Larry mentions, I use a 5-gallon pail with a small hole in the base positioned toward the tree. The pail empties over a 10-minute period of time. I like that idea. So a person can put a small hole or drill a little series of holes, not too many, down in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket. That's accomplishing two things. Number one, you're measuring how much water you're putting on, and then it gives that slow trickle down into the root system. So I really like that idea, Larry. Thank you. Next question. So many people with half-dead lilac trees this year. Yes, the lilacs were susceptible, and many came down with a foliage disease that caused the leaves to turn crisp and brown by midsummer, and they fell off. And then the lilacs, because of the stress, were triggered into blooming again. And what does the future look like for the Japanese tree lilacs and the lilac shrub that suffered so much this year? Many in the area had only half their normal amount of foliage. Yes, and so this is a huge stress. And that is a concern because anytime a plant, tree, shrub, perennial loses its leaves early, such as halfway through the growing season, that plant is not able to photosynthesize and store up energy for next year. And so there's a chance that next year could be not as much bloom or not as much vigor. But there is a way to check on trees that went kind of, that lost all their leaves, or lilacs that lost their leaves early, and that is to look at the twigs. So on lilacs, the buds are big and fat and green. So take a look. And next year's buds on trees and shrubs are already formed. So on trees and shrubs, you can examine the twigs, maybe rub a few of those buds. Are they nice and moist and kind of green inside if you kind of pull them apart a little? And scratch the twigs also. If under the outer bark, if you see a nice green layer, that's a sign there's life there. And also bend the twigs. If they break and snap easily, then that's a dead twig. But if they're pliable, then there's life there. So we're going to knock on wood, but in the meantime, you can examine to see if there is life there, and that life being the buds that would have formed. All right, and Tom says we wanted to share some exciting news. Tom says, because sometimes I do a survey after webinars whether you took action. Well, Tom mentioned that they certainly did take action. Since attending a webinar last week on geraniums, we've potted 244 parent geraniums and started an additional 74 cuttings. That's awesome. Wow, 244 geranium plants taken in and overwintered. That is absolutely tremendous. I love it. Thank you for the kind comments. And do you use a systemic insecticide on blooming plants like mandevilla? The hummingbirds visit mine and wonder if the effects of a systemic will remain next summer. So in systemic insecticides, such as if applied to a mandevilla, which is a beautiful blooming plant with kind of trumpet-shaped blossoms, and the hummingbirds and insects do visit them, if we applied systemic, that systemic is taken up into the flowers of those, and the systemic can last 6 months to a year. And so mandevilla, and mandevilla is very prone to mealybugs and spider mites and everything else. But if mandevilla is going to be outside in a spot where pollinators or hummingbirds would visit, I think I would probably not put a systemic on mandevilla because by next spring, it could all be out of the system, but it could still be lingering. And so I guess I wouldn't take that chance. So instead, to treat the mandevilla, I would use insecticidal soap, monitor closely,
and use insecticidal soap or something less long-acting on those. Is it too late to apply lawn fertilizer? Been so dry and warm, so I haven't done it yet. I think at this point, even if we were to get moisture, fertilizing in October has become a little controversial. And so I think I'd maybe at this point just wait until next spring. I don't think, especially with the lawn going to pretty soon slow down, I don't think the impact would be the same as though if we had been able to fertilize in September and have it watered in really well. Is the black mulch that is free from the city good for vegetable or flower gardens? Um, okay, and the reason I say is because um, someone emailed me this summer that had used the city compost in their vegetable planter and for tomatoes, and the tomatoes developed herbicide injury, and the tomato fruit that developed was the most grotesque thing that I've ever seen. And so, although some people have had good success with the city compost. The city, any municipal compost has the ability, I would say, the ability to still have herbicides in it that may be there in residue. And so I guess use at one's own, with some caution, use at one's own risk, I guess. Um, and I don't know what to say. We're hoping several of us at NDSU are hoping to get together with the city to ensure that the herbicide residue in the compost is totally gone. So, and the city is very workable with that. So we're going to continue to work on that. Otherwise, it is certainly still a consideration. My tall Canadian roses are hanging over the fence onto the sidewalk. Is it okay to tie them up to the fence as I don't want to prune them now? Yeah, I like the idea of tying them up, probably better than pruning, and then prune in the spring. What should I do with lilac bushes, especially those in my windbreak rows that seem to die? Should I just wait to see if they are alive in the spring? Yes. When Mary and I took a drive out in the country a few weeks ago, gosh, we saw some hedgerows of lilacs that were totally bare of leaves due to the disease. And so maybe check them just for your own, kind of your own satisfaction or acknowledgement to know that they still have good buds. And there's not much we can do. If it was one or two lilacs, we could rake the leaves up. But if it's in a big row, we of course can't rake the leaves and get rid of that. So we're gonna, I think, on some of those situations, have to kind of keep our fingers crossed. Okay, lilacs mentions, I want to get rid of some of the lawn area and next spring turn those areas into pollinator gardens. Is it okay to put cardboard now? Would it be okay to staple tarps over the cardboard? And and also wondering about the geranium webinar. I will send the recording of that to everyone that's registered tonight for tonight also. So anyway, yes, cardboard works very well as an underlayment to smother grass or weeds. I use cardboard a lot under our mulch around in perennial gardens, so that'd be fine to put the cardboard down now. You could um, of course, the main thing would be to be able to fasten it down so the winter winds don't blow it away, and stapling tarps over the cardboard to hold it down. I think I like that idea, Lilac. All right. And Scott Swanson, our tech person at NDSU who helps me with these webinars, put in the chat box also the Geranium webinar link. And I will send that also to those who attended tonight's webinar. All right, and I do believe, let me just check and see if there was anything else. In the Q&A, we have a few questions. I understand not fertilizing after Labor Day. What about the winterizer fertilizer? I've never looked at what it is, so I'm not certain if it would be good. Now, actually, the winterizer fertilizer was developed for lawns down in the southern United States. Winterizer type fertilizer has a little of the extra potash in, and our soils are pretty good in that. So we don't really need winterizer fertilizer. If that was all that was on the shelf, then that's fine to use. Sometimes that's what is stocked in the fall of the year, but just regular lawn fertilizer, the same that you would use in spring, is just fine. Does burning the asparagus tops off in spring help the plant to start earlier? Well, I'm not sure if it helps it start early or not. I'd be maybe a little leery of burning asparagus tops because maybe it would damage the asparagus itself. Um, but yeah, that would be interesting though. But just cutting the tops, I think, would be fine. It's interesting though, if burning would help the plant start earlier. I'm not sure. What about hostas? Cut them down this fall? Yep, hosta can definitely be cut down this fall. My spirea needs to be cut back to regenerate. The best time to do that is early next spring in April before the new growth starts for rejuvenating shrubs. Did you say young trees need 10 to 15 gallons water every 7 to 10 days? Yes, that'll depend. If it's just a 1 inch diameter smaller tree, the 5 gallons. If it's a tree that's been planted over the course of the last couple of years that's got maybe a 3 inch diameter trunk, then more like 15 gallons. And no need to do that more than every 7 to 10 days because evaporation isn't that high this year. Is there any advantage to using a deep root water for trees in the fall? The deep root watering systems that you attach to the end of a hose and the prong that goes down in, that's a good way to get water down in. Right now, I'm finding good moisture down below though, and so it seems especially the upper foot that needs moisture. Uh, how do you incorporate organic material around perennials when wood mulch is in place? Well, what we do is we rake away the wood mulch a little bit and then top dress around the plant. Perennial roots don't go too far out, so even going out maybe 6 to 8 inches out around the perennial, and then incorporating a little organic matter or peat moss down kind of into the surface, kind of just hoe it in a little bit, cultivate it in a little bit, and then put the wood mulch back in place. Small hydrangea shrubs, should we cut back the flowers? Those can be cut back. Ron asked, do you use preen in the spring? Preen is a good weed preventer. And Monarda powdery mildew, should I cut it back this fall? And Ron, I would. I would cut the Monarda back because of the powdery mildew, because that does survive on the plant. All right. And spirea, spring pruning would be better. Well, thank you all very much. Wonderful questions, and thank you all. Enjoy the fall season, and gosh, I'm hoping that the weather stays nice for a while yet. That'll all give us a little more time to get all of these things done. Well, everyone have a wonderful evening and enjoy the rest of the fall. Thank you so much.